The Second Amendment is probably the most controversial and polarizing amendment in the American Constitution. There is much debate on how it should be interpreted, and many feel that the wording is not clear and vague. Some believe that this ambiguity was on purpose, and it's up to us to decide how to interpret it. But I'm not sure that's the case. I believe that the Founding Fathers worded this in such a way that it could not be misinterpreted. Now, we know this because there was some back and forth revisions that happened to this amendment and the wording of it before it was officially adopted. This implies that they clearly took the time to think it out. Remember, these men were geniuses, and they made sure to take the time to word it in a way where it would be clearly interpreted properly. I believe they worded it in such a way where it couldn't be interpreted in any other way than that which they intended. If we approach the amendment with this assumption, can we more clearly interpret its meaning? Well, let's look at the amendment, which states, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Notice all the commas in that sentence. This is one of the first causes of confusion and misinterpretation. Let's clear our minds for a moment and approach this as if we were aliens visiting from outer space, seeing this amendment for the first time. It starts with a well-regulated militia. Well, what does well-regulated mean? When you think of the term regulated, you probably think of rules, laws, and even restrictions. This is what comes up in our modern interpretation since we hear about regulations all the time. But given the historical context, the term regulated meant organized and disciplined rather than regulation by a governmental body. So we could safely reword this part to say a well-organized and disciplined militia. Well, what is a militia? It kind of sounds like military, doesn't it? But a militia is not a military. They're two different words. Even in our modern dictionary, the term militia means a civilian army. Now, you might be thinking something like a National Guard being a militia, but this is not a civilian army. This is a state-run army. Also, if we look at the historical context, the term militia referred to a body of armed citizens distinct from a state-run military. The concept of a militia was deeply rooted in English history, and it was carried over in American colonial practices. Militias could be called upon for law enforcement, public defense, and other public duties. Actually, militias were even key in winning our independence and creating the United States of America. These citizens were expected to provide their own weapons and in some cases, even participate in regular training. The concept of the militia reflected the distrust of standing armies, which were seen as tools of tyranny by the monarchs in Europe. Many American colonists believed that a professional standing armies could threaten the freedom of the people, whereas a militia composed of the people themselves would be a safeguard against tyranny. So a well-regulated militia literally means a well-organized and disciplined body of armed citizens. Now, the second part of the amendment, after the first comma, states, being necessary to the security of a free state. This distinct clause is clearly referring to the first part, namely saying that a well-organized militia is necessary for freedom. We can therefore move on to the third part. Now, here's where it gets a little tricky. Some interpreters of the amendment only focus on the first part, and they say that the right to bear arms are only for militia, which they interpret as being for the military, which, of course, we know now that not to be the case. Others mainly focus on this second part of the amendment, which we're about to go over, the right to bear arms. But remember, this amendment is one whole sentence, carefully worded to be taken together as a whole. People say that this part of the amendment says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But it doesn't say that. It says, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. Punctuation is important in legal context. And this amendment and every comma within it, every word, was carefully and clearly thought out by the authors. So because there's a comma after the right of the people to keep and bear arms, the clause shall not be infringed stands on its own. Well then, what exactly shall not be infringed? Well, the entire amendment. You see, that final part of the amendment doesn't just apply to the right of the people to keep and bear arms, it also applies to a well-regulated militia. What does this mean, and how does this change how we approach the interpretation of the Second Amendment? First, let's get clear in our understanding and translate it into our modern American lingo. Given what we just learned, we could reword the amendment as a well-organized and disciplined body of armed citizens is necessary to the security of a free state, and it shall not be infringed upon. And the right of the people to keep and bear arms also should not be infringed upon. The word infringe literally means to limit, undermine, or break. And it implies that it is the government's responsibility to ensure a well-organized and disciplined body of armed citizens. Are we well-disciplined and organized when it comes to arms? Whose responsibility is it to ensure that we are well-disciplined and organized? Well, according to the Second Amendment, it's up to the state, which means they haven't been doing their job really well. Now, remember, this doesn't mean that the government should limit or regulate arms in some way, as that would be infringing. No, instead, it means that they should be ensuring the discipline and organization of these arms. Is this indeed what the Founding Fathers envisioned? And is there historical evidence for this? The short answer is yes. One of the earliest attempts to fulfill this governmental mandate was the Militia Act of 1792. This required all able-bodied men ages 18 to 45 to enroll in the militia, provide their own arms, and get required training. It wasn't until the Militia Act of 1903, over 100 years later, where they established the National Guard. But the concept of a militia in the 18th century was quite different than the state-run military that is the National Guard. To give you an example, I was able to get legally armed here in New York City. And being in New York City, it was extremely difficult to get licensed. But I was hoping to get some training. I was hoping to get some help on learning the laws of how to handle my arm, of how to clean it, of when I could even properly take it out for defense. But I received no such training. And I had to go out and get answers on my own, which I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't do. So I think that someone is not living up to their constitutional mandate, and I believe that it is the government's responsibility for the lack of discipline when it comes to arms. Just recently, the parents of a mass shooter in the state of Michigan were sentenced to 15 years because they were deemed to be responsible for their child's actions. Well, shouldn't we be holding the state to those same standards? Shouldn't they be responsible for when citizens are not disciplined and organized when it comes to firearms? I do believe that this was the intention of the Second Amendment, and that it was so well worded to ensure that this would be the case. To give you an example, we could take the structure of the Second Amendment and apply it to almost any other concept and see how we would interpret it. For example, what if we took the Second Amendment and applied it to healthcare? It would be worded something like, a well-regulated healthcare system being necessary for a healthy state, the right of the people to keep and have medicine shall not be infringed. Do you see how that would imply that a well-organized and disciplined healthcare system consisting of doctors, hospitals, and medicine would be required to satisfy the amendment? Do you see how that would imply that it would be the government's responsibility to ensure that this healthcare system would be in place? We could do the same wordplay with education and say, a well-regulated school system being necessary to an educated state, the right of the people to keep and bear books shall not be infringed. You see, it's not about the books or the school system. It's about all of these things being well organized and disciplined, and most importantly, not limited or undermined. And yet, this is indeed what the government is doing with the Second Amendment, limiting and undermining it. Not just the fact that they're doing it with the arms themselves, but in the fact that they're not providing the discipline and organization what this amendment calls for. Imagine if we did have a well-organized and disciplined society of armed citizens, where we all understood the safety protocols, the laws, and the proper use of arms. We would be an unstoppable force, and violent crime would virtually be eliminated. This is what the Founding Fathers had envisioned when they wrote this amendment. This is what they knew would make America strong and free for all time. It is time that we uphold this constitutional mandate. It is time that we hold our governments accountable to this amendment. Let us allow this right to be infringed upon no longer. Let us become the disciplined and organized body of citizens who protect our country, our freedom, and each other.